So hi everyone,
And I would like
Dale Sumner. She's an ARCDECRA Fellow in English and Digital Humanities and the Australian National University. She works at the intersection of surveillance, studies, digital culture, and the humanities with an emphasis on how literary texts help us understand human subjectivity under conditions of datification. She also has expertise in poetry and poetics, digital humanities, cultural data, facial recognition technology, and digital research infrastructures. Tyne's recent books include Small Data is Beautiful and Lyric Eye, The Poetics of 20th Century Surveillance by Routledge 2021. She has published widely on topics ranging from contemporary fiction, art and film to cultural databases and virtual learning environments. Tyne frequently speaks on panels and at public events on transformative approaches to the arts and humanities and has got more than 50 years experience in interdisciplinary research, engagement, and communication. She is president of the Australasian Association for Digital Humanities and is on the International Steering Committee of the Art, AI, and Digital Ethics Research Network. Her tangential, though no less enthusiastic, interests are astronomy, library architectures, and David Bowie. Very welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Arya, and thank you to the Literature and Science Group for inviting me to speak in this excellent seminar series, which is showcasing some really fascinating research and scholarship at the crossroads of literary studies and various scientific fields. And so today I'm hopefully going to do just that. In this talk, I want to theorize a framework for thinking about how emerging forms of subjectivity manifest in contemporary literary fiction, especially in relation to networked digital technology. So this idea brings together a few threads of a project that I'm working on about surveillance and global fiction. And in this project, I'm interested not only in how literary texts represent intensifying forms of surveillance, but also in how surveillance and its close relative dataveillance has come to shape and reconfigure the contemporary novel. Its formal devices, its tone, its modes of self-referentiality, its aesthetic markers, and its narrative and intersubjective techniques. So as my title here suggests, I'm going to work with two key terms, subjectivity and distributed cognition. And I want to apply these terms to what I'm calling the contemporary social media novel, a somewhat crude subcategory of the recently coined internet novel. Perhaps the most well-known precursor to the internet novel is William Gibson's 1984 novel Neuromancer, one of the earliest works of the cyberpunk genre. In Gibson's narrative, we meet Henry Case, a down-and-out hacker who comes into contact with a powerful artificial intelligence that presents readers with a future in which consciousness can be transplanted to a cyberspace and exist independent of a human body. Since the publication of this novel 40 years ago now, the web has of course evolved in complexity and scale, with datification coming to dominate how people live, socialize, and work with and through the online space. And with this new reality on our doorstep, a key question for the aspiring internet novelist seemed to emerge, one incisively articulated by the journalist Orlando Bird, who recently asked, quote, "Does the internet itself, a fully formed alternative world with its own preemptively metaphorical language, leave much for the novelist to do?" My answer to this question is yes, of course it does. But in saying that, I also want to trouble the definition of the novel as it is traditionally understood by focusing on how the internet has fundamentally come to change the way that we speak, think, and write. In other words, I'm interested in the formal challenge faced by authors wanting to depict the chaotic, fragmented, and datafied experience of the internet as it relates to human thought. Embracing the internet's literary possibilities necessitates more than simply imitating broken text and interactive superficiality. Moreover, the internet's patent contradictions, its creativity, its anonymity, its surveillance, its proliferating forms of public expression, and its depravity present unique challenges for the novelist attempting to represent how human beings interact with the web. That is, how to maintain narrative intrigue and experiment with narrative form without bordering on total linguistic disorder, a postmodern technique that is now arguably literary cliché. Adding to these representational challenges, the past 2 decades have also been marked by the hyperperformativity and profit-making objectives of social media. A fully converged political economy the social scientist Christian Fuchs has referred to as corporate colonialism. Novelists have in turn responded to this, writing fiction aimed at explaining the social, affective, technological, emotional, and even environmental implications of lives lived almost entirely online. The internet novel genre, as it exists up to the present, is characterized most markedly by linguistic typographical fragmentation. It's an attempt to dramatize and mimic the experience and dizzying disintegrated effect of the internet and social media itself. An ecology of datafied relations Mary Flanagan has described as, quote, a combined subject position. And this particular emerging genre has also come under consideration for its intriguing experimentations with literary form that speak back to the technological conditions of its own production. Other conventions of the genre include such things as networked narration, presented as vignettes or sub-narratives in the form of perhaps short lyric essays, short, often self-deprecating biographical revelations, raw forms of intertextuality, such as the insertion of text message exchanges, passages from emails, and so on, hashtags, linguistic abstraction, and snippets of informational minutiae that border on the absurd, a form of disclosure akin to that which Koskela has described as empowered exhibitionism. Some other terms used to describe this genre include such coinages as metamodernism, the new sincerity, digital modernism, and probably my favorite, hysterical realism. Now, despite its numerous palpable inadequacies, the internet novel has received a fair amount of scholarly attention of late, not least because many of its authors have themselves ascended from the self-congratulatory and limitlessly externalizing instruments of the internet, thus publishing into an existing milieu of online exposure that both provides the content for the novel and simultaneously anticipates and promotes its own reception. Now, I will explain what I mean by distributed cognition in a moment, but first I want to digress with a recent literary hoax that in many ways exemplifies the commercial, relational, and neoliberal context out of which social media emerges, and then by extension, the social media novel. Many readers of contemporary internet fiction will be familiar with the work of Dave Eggers, whose 2013 Silicon Valley novel, The Circle, chronicles a fictional techno-dystopian company called The Circle, which has effectively amalgamated the functions of Google, Apple, Microsoft, YouTube, Facebook, and then called Twitter. In an unsubtle nod to both Orwell and the performative logics of more recent platforms such as Snapchat and TikTok, The Circle's governing slogan is, "All that happens must be known." And yet the novel's narrative thought experiment is neither wholly prophetic, nor realism, nor satire. It simply paints the digital universe as it really is. The film's 2017 adaptation, starring Emma Watson, is described as a techno-thriller, an Orwellian drama about surveillance society, IT babble, and everyday workplace tribulations. A narrative, if you will, of the information age. This adaptation was unanimously derided, with one reviewer describing it as a film with, quote, the slapstick social comedy of an old baseball umpire. Ooh. And another calling it absolutely a failure, but an interesting one. Such responses as these likely reflect the film's too literal and too obvious representation of the novel's otherwise entertaining repetitiveness. In literary prose, the arduous addiction and predictability of social media can be rendered amusing, funny even. On film, however, the existential realities of the internet era are perhaps too real, verging at best on paranoia, at worst, just plain boring. Roughly a decade later, Eggers published his sequel internet novel, The Every, in which the social media monstrosity that is The Circle merges with the world's most voracious e-commerce site, creating, you guessed it, a company called The Every. When the novel's protagonist, Delaney Wells, joins the company and becomes frighteningly cognizant of its growing power, she plots to go and destroy it from the inside. Wells pitches her scheme to other developers and thus begins a spiral of cover-up, resistance, and deception, culminating in a dramatic corporate twist, which takes place, fittingly perhaps, beside a waterfall in the middle of Oregon. Now, Eggers, who compares today's data profiling technologies to an obsessive boyfriend, is especially wary of the effects that social media has on the brain. He's interested, to paraphrase, in the need that tech companies have to control and surveil how we use their products and the unending relationships we have with the software that underpins them. In publishing this novel, he even went so far as to extend this distrust to the material and economic conditions of the literary marketplace itself. Turning the tables on the very conditions and corporations that the novel critiques, Eggers established an unorthodox publishing arrangement that saw The Every released in at least 32 different hardcover versions, each randomly disseminated and none available for sale on Amazon. Speaking to Vanity Fair, he commented, "We're exhausted as a species, and it's not like we can always avoid aiding these monopolies. But maybe this will drive a few people to look around the corner and see that there's a little store that might benefit from a purchase or two." What I'm sketching here then is the ways in which the novel's distribution came to instantiate the particulars of its plot, which itself eerily mirrors the surveillance capitalist regime of our current era, one defined by the expropriation and commercialization of personal data for predictive analytics, that which Shoshana Zuboff has described as behavioral futures markets. And so Eggers's strategically orchestrated literary hoax is perhaps less a hoax then than it is a form of metatextuality that characterizes the contemporary social media novel, a method of, I might call, self-conscious literary sociology that imbricates the digitally mediated reception of contemporary literature with its originating source material. It's about the internet, on the internet, and attempting to break free from the internet. The novel is therefore not only speculative in its content about the possibility of overturning the technocratic system, it also performs a literal speculative act by, through Eggers' stunt, removing itself from the machinations of Amazon's AI-generated market domination. In her recent book, Glitch Feminism, the American curator and writer Legacy Russell conceives a version of this strategy, when she calls it AFK, away from keyboard. For Russell, who writes in terms of Afrofuturism and feminist new materialism, it is not simply enough, though, to eschew the online world, since its in real life alternative is permeated with sexism, embodied white supremacy, and homophobia. Instead, in Russell's work, glitching becomes a way to disrupt the corrupted conventions of datification in exchange for, to quote Russell, participatory action that challenges the status quo. Now, perhaps I'm giving Eggers far too much credit here in drawing a comparison to Russell's groundbreaking manifesto, but I'm making this connection as a way of pointing out the ways in which the hermeneutics, if you will, of the internet novel cannot be separated out from the social, affective, and technological implications of networked digital technology. Or as Eagleston and O'Gorman write of the state of much 21st century literary fiction, quote, any attempt to write this situation is also part of this situation. How, they ask, can we grasp the production of more narrative about digital culture as the material reproduction of the toxic environmental conditions of digital culture? And so with this inseparability in mind that I want to think about the social media novel in relation to the scientific concept of distributed cognition. And it would be remiss of me in the current moment and a talk like this one to not present you with at least one AI-generated image of digitality. So here you are in all its wonder, voila. Now, my motive of bringing science into conversation with the internet novel is twofold. First, it's an interdisciplinary approach to analyze the impact of the contemporary novel on digital culture. That is, as a source that not only maps out our present as it is, unfolding in front of us, but is also actively contributing to how we understand the technological change taking place. In his essay, What is the Contemporary?, Giorgio Agamben writes that contemporariness is comprised of both adherence to one's time and a disjunction from it. And I would posit that the literary text, which is best placed to achieve these two poles simultaneously, that is, to be a register of the current moment, and yet enact some form of estrangement from that moment through fiction's unique formal properties. My second aim in invoking science here is to consider contemporary fiction beyond the boundaries of traditional disciplinary critique, by which I mean that the sciences can help us think about the cognitive effects of literature on the brain, how it taps into empathy, fear, anger, joy, and the wider range of human emotions. Such a theory is by no means new. It has been advanced, for example, by the literary historian Lisa Sunshine, who argues that combining cognitive psychology and literary studies can help explain behavior in terms of underlying states of mind, those that characterize our interaction with literary texts. Applying this idea to the present, literary form can function to then perhaps imitate and explain the 21st century that is networked in manifold ways. Or to be more succinct, as the editors of the Routledge Companion to 21st Century Literature recently wrote, in a rapidly digitalizing world, the literary continues to offer an alternative experience, a territory different from, quote, neoliberal teleology or instrumentalizing reason, a landscape neither utopian nor dystopian, but radically open. So these concepts of openness and interconnectivity also are pertinent to theories of distributed cognition, a theory first developed by the cognitive anthropologist Edwin Hutchins in the 1990s. Hutchins's theory posits that cognition extends across not only the mind, but also the body and the world. That is, the mind becomes distributed across socio-cultural systems that comprise the tools we use to think and perceive the world. Simple enough. But examples of this are everywhere, from the use of a notebook that functions as an extension of our thoughts to the use of our fingers that might help us count. Take, for instance, Flemish painter Quentin Matstey's 16th century work, The Moneylender and His Wife, which depicts a couple engaging with various objects used to count loans, and in so doing extends the mind's capacity for memory and keeping track of wealth. Hutchinson's distributed cognition thesis would later be picked up by philosophers Andy Clark and David Chalmers in their 1998 paper, The Extended Mind, in which they proposed that some objects in our external environment can end up forming part of our cognitive process, and by extension, function as part of the mind itself. An obvious candidate for this in the present moment is the perilous iPhone, with all its candy-like visual addictiveness, seemingly universal utility, and capacity to quite literally render us mindless through scrolling. Indeed, absent-minded scrolling on social media, organized as it is by targeted advertising and personalized content, is perhaps arguably the ultimate inverse of Hutchinson's distributed cognition theory, insofar as cognition seems to leave the brain entirely in the presence of the ever-seductive light of the iPhone, with its endless self-help memes, cat videos, and, let's face it, fun to watch, but impossible to recreate makeup tutorials. But I pause here to save us from any further techno-dystopian rumination by returning to literature and the question of how we might understand the novel as staging some kind of distributed cognition. It's worth pointing out from the outset that contemporary fiction is not the first to present the mind as what might be called distributed, to, as it were, theatricalize thought in literary form. Lawrence Stern's 1750 novel Tristram Shandy, for example, contains a vast array of exaggerated instances of what could be referred to as the extended mind. The novel purports to be a fictional autobiography of the main character Tristram, who attempts to tell the story of his life, except that in being an ever-present narrator and painstakingly meticulous commentator throughout, he never really tells us anything about himself at all. Instead, the painfully protracted narrative involves endless digressions and distractions in which Tristram describes the lives of pretty much everyone except himself, his father, Uncle Toby, and a large cast of other characters, some but not all relevant to the biography. One of the central jokes of the novel is that Tristram can never actually tell us anything useful at all, without ironically getting sidetracked with philosophical musings on the act of writing a biographical novel. So much so that we don't even get to his own birth until volume 3. So Tristram's, and by extension Stern's, way out of this debacle is to use different kinds of machines that seem to extend or assist human cognition. One of these is an imaginary writing aid that helps the novelist sketch out characters. Another is a magical glass device designed to help the writer understand the workings of a character's soul. And other mechanical devices appear as we go on, each in turn apparently enhancing the narrator's mind such that he might be able to complete the task assigned to him. In the modernist period, a different kind of distributed cognition unfolds. And it plays out mostly in the stream of consciousness technique taken up by writers such as James Joyce, William Faulkner, Marcel Proust, and Virginia Woolf. Woolf's novels alert us, of course, to the highly discursive and situationally inflected nature of human thought. A master of the mind in action, Woolf writes literary scenarios in which the direction of logic, the making of a decision, or the interpretation of memory happen as if in the real time of the mind. Her prose gives us access not to just first-person perspective, but the ways that thought is often produced out of external stimuli that might be entirely imperceptible to one person, but intensely evocative to another. Often in Woolf's novels, characters experience existential thoughts that appear to be fashioned almost entirely out of external circumstances. And Woolf's trains of thought are often comical and quotidian, but they're also haunting, such as when the character Lily Briscoe has her famous epiphany, where Woolf writes, "So that is marriage, Lily thought, a man and a woman looking at a girl throwing a ball." This is a classic case of Woolf's so-called tunneling technique, A girl observes a couple looking at a girl, and suddenly all of her thoughts align. To the Lighthouse, published in 1927, is full of these kinds of perceptive vortices. In the novel's famous starlings passage, for example, multiple minds converge as a flock of starlings fly suddenly over a terrace. To read a passage from this section. All of this danced up and down like a company of gnats, each separate but all marvelously controlled in an invisible elastic net. Danced up and down in Lily's mind, in and about the branches of the pear tree, where still hung in effigy the scrubbed kitchen table, symbol of her profound respect for Mr. Ramsay's mind, until her thought, which had spun quicker and quicker, exploded of its own intensity. She felt released. A shot went off close at hand, and there came, flying from its fragments, frightened, effusive, tumultuous, a flock of starlings. Now, in this remarkable intersubjective moment, different characters' perspectives turn on the physical and environmental phenomena around them. Woolf begins with the image of an invisible elastic net that she uses to explain the mind of the painter Lily Briscoe. And yet, as the passage progresses, she positions the sound of a shot firing and the subsequent scattering of the starlings within, or at least somehow connected to, the minds of several people standing nearby, offering a far more complex and contested version of consciousness than a standard authorial voice or a first-person narrator, for example. As different characters' thoughts spiral outwards, depending on their perspective of the birds, Woolf shows how thought extends to the external world, and in which peripheral factors that influence thought become indistinguishable from thought itself. To pick up here again the extended mind thesis in relation to Woolf's prose, we might say that this passage shows how, to quote Clark and Chalmers, if cognition depends on factor X in an especially strong or clear way, then X is part of the thinker's cognitive system. This interplay between the individual subject and his or her technological or social environment was a preoccupation, as we know, for modernist writers, who sought to understand the extent to which human beings were perhaps losing some of their cognition in the face of mechanical reproduction and regimentation. But to turn now from the modernist to the contemporary period, the internet novel, my subject here, and its attendant articulations of subjectivity in the present moment, is grappling with a datafied world that changes as frequently as the thoughts of Woolf's characters. Or to put this another way, as the essayist and critic Tyne has recently argued, what drives the, quote, anxiety of the internet novel might be that the internet is an inherently unstable form, something that evolves as quickly as it cements. And it's this tension, or this impossibility of stable representation, that seems to underpin many recent novels on the topic. Calvin Cosselt's 2021 novel, Several People Are Typing, for example, is narrated entirely as a series of Slack messages sent between employees at a New York-based PR firm. After having his consciousness accidentally uploaded into the company's Slack channel, the novel's protagonist, Gerald, experiences the dystopian abyss of a fully disembodied life online. And he must navigate this new digital reality via the assistance of Slack's AI, Slackbot. While the novel's central focus is on the intricacies of virtual work and the data-driven milieu of contemporary corporate culture, the novel also engages a critique, however kitsch, of the subjective states and cognitive frameworks that our digital environments now produce. Part of this novel might be thought as an example of Clark and Chalmers's epistemic action at work, in which actions out in the world aid and augment cognitive processes such as recognition and search. Yet, just as digital communication has come to facilitate instantaneity, new forms of accessibility, and information at scale, so too have its computational shortcuts and technological gimmicks, those we all encounter every day in some of the work that we do. These have occluded meaning and tend to impoverish empirical logic. In an attempt to convince Slackbot to release him from the disembodied space of the company channel, Gerald ends up, partway through the novel, in a communicative feedback loop where language completely breaks down. One section from the novel reads, and I'll only make you suffer through this short moment. Gerald, return to body. Return. Return to body, please. Self. Self. EXE. Slackbot. I'm afraid I don't understand. I'm sorry. Gerald. Go back. Leave Slack. Leave Slack. Slackbot. I searched for that in our Help Me Centre. Perhaps these articles will help. Reduce noise in Slack. Leave a channel. So despite here the novel's obvious computational typographical arrangement, designed to be, as you can see, representative of the vacuous tenor of online workplace exchanges, the novel nevertheless engages a series of intersubjective relations. Slackbot to Gerald, Gerald to Slackbot, Slackbot to colleagues, and so on. And these position the reader inside the world of the corporate database. Such an effect is akin to what Melissa Gregg has metaphorically described as data sweat, to emphasize the materiality of the digital and digitized information that moves like a liquid in and out of various bodily states. As Gerald travels erratically between different conversations in Slack, his desperate commands to the Slackbot are recorded and left behind like sweat on the body. His desperate commands are also akin to what Deborah Lupton calls the byproducts of other online interactions within the broader digital network, forms, if you will, of digital breadcrumbs. So one defining characteristic, as you can see in my example here, of the post-2000 internet novel might be an awareness that digital technology and human existence are now almost entirely inseparable, even if that awareness means torturing readers with literal renderings of the dialectical space of the web inside passages of novels. A device that could be read as cleverly ironic or just as easily, unforgivably predictable and banal. And yet, novelists writing today are responding not just to the ubiquity of the internet as an inextricable part of everyday life, but also to emergent forms of online interactivity that involve what Andrew McStay has called three-dimensional internet experiences, organized around input devices such as cameras, augmented reality, virtual reality, biometrics, and so on. This enmeshment of internet infrastructures into routine experience was first theorized by Michael Haim as virtual realism, a term also taken up by Chalmers, who argues that, to quote, virtual realities are genuine realities that are meaningful, perhaps beyond the realm of fiction. McStay also uses the term surveillance physics to refer to the commodification of personal data that might take place inside these kinds of metaverse. This is the outcome of when data collected about biometrics, behavioral gaze, neural activity, and so on, is added to other kinds of data about situational context to inform the laws of how that reality operates. And so other forms of recent internet novel have attempted to capture this new techno-reality, some with self-deprecating humor, and others in directly autobiographical terms, the kind of tell it as it is style novel that traces the whims and online interactions, discursive thought patterns, and so on of the everyday iPhone-addicted millennial. This is by no means an exhaustive snapshot, but you can see here, this list includes novels that range stylistically from heightened lyrical prose to plain-speaking sarcasm, to those structured in more traditional chapter-like arrangements, to styles more evocative, for better or worse, of the disjointed fragments of text that we encounter online each day. Something, though, that I think connects many of these novels is an apparent interest in questions of inside-outside, self and machine, when it comes to datafied surveillance. In many of these novels, to borrow a description from David Lyon, the boundaries between one place and another, between inside and outside the body itself, are indeterminate. As a result, surveillance, and by extension subjectivity, comes to depend on dispersed, ephemeral, and less traceable forms of sociality and power. Moreover, many, if not all of these novels, are interested in the ways that datification both produces a kind of publicly presenting, commercially predictable self, as much as it produces new forms of interiority that the novel as a genre is uniquely positioned to explore. This ironic, I suppose, double-sided coin is described by Katherine Johnson in her recent monograph, Profiles and Plotlines. Here, Johnson writes, to quote, "To the extent that literature trains readers to peer into people's lived experiences with pleasure and curiosity, it also trains them to understand surveillance as fundamentally partial and subjective." Johnson tracks in this book what she calls a profile epistemology, which refers to the typical justifications for data surveillance and the often flawed premises that support them. So with this concept in view, I want to conclude by looking briefly at just two of these novels to consider how they go about treating subjectivity and distributed cognition in similar but also slightly different ways. In her debut novel, No One Is Talking About This from 2021, the American poet and essayist Patricia Lockwood presents a critique of the extent to which continuous engagement with the data-driven internet of the 21st century is transforming how we've come to understand both our corporeal and subjective selves. Described by the critic Christian Lawrenson as virtual realism, the novel tests out the possibilities of lyrical prose as a medium for representing human thought, memory, and emotion under the conditions of ubiquitous datification. Lockwood's novel focuses on an unnamed woman who lives her life extremely online by virtue of being extremely active on social media. She posts a tweet that says simply, "Can a dog be twins?" The tweet goes viral and transforms her life into a whirlwind tour of interviews, travel, and hypervisible internet presence. While she never refers explicitly to either her smartphone nor the internet, the novel's narrator speaks at length of a mysterious place called the portal, which we take to be both a metaphor and a literalization of dataveillance online. She opened the portal, the novel begins, and the mind met her more than halfway inside. Why did the portal feel so private when you only entered it when you needed to be everywhere? In these opening lines, the novel alerts readers to its metafictional project, which is to interrogate the concurrent awfulness and absurdity of what it means to be extremely connected, and therefore how the internet has come to fundamentally organize the way we think, even during moments when we are not technically online. These slippages, which I referred to earlier, between online, offline, body, mind, social media, and internal thought, create a kind of nowhere place, a zone with no edges. Everything is fuzzy. This literary effect is akin to something like the aesthetic light and space bombardment of the American artist James Turrell, whose works challenge not just the visual dimensions of space in the gallery context, but the mind's ability to perceive eternal space and time. Like Turrell's installations, Lockwood's novel places us so far inside the void that we seem to become the void, unable to see where we begin and where the internet ends. by self-consciously accentuating the aesthetic and affective force of literary language, in itself already a uniquely subjective form. The novel is persuasively representative, and I would therefore argue by extension powerfully imitative of the extended mind of the online world, a portal into which a new way of understanding the effects of the internet on human cognition might occur. In contrast, Argentinian author Samantha Schweblin's 2018 novel Kentucky's, translated into English and renamed Little Eyes by Megan McDowell in 2020, traces a dispersed spatial and temporal form of digital subjectivity that exists in the connected infrastructures of small, cute, terrifying, dystopian home surveillance devices. In the novel, stuffed animals called Kentuckys are equipped with wheels and a camera and connected to a wireless network, not much unlike the iPhones we use constantly every day. Users in the novel can choose to be either a keeper, that is, a device that watches them, or a dweller, in which they purchase a code that allows them to connect to another user and watch that person's life from miles away, but simultaneously, as it were, from inside the animal that roams around a stranger's home. Channeling the kinds of cyberpunk imaginaries developed in works such as Neuromancer, Little Eyes presents a not too distant future in which home surveillance becomes fused with forms of domestic utility, which itself is disguised as entertaining, albeit perverted, game space. Crucially, though, Schweblin's novel demonstrates the ways in which human cognition, when implanted into the social network of smart home technology, can result in a kind of creepy form of participatory surveillance, one that produces, I want to suggest, entirely new forms of subjectification. In particular, different characters in the novel come to understand their own affective and cognitive selves as inextricably connected with the person on the other side of the world to whom their Kentucky talks. To quote one passage from the novel, in which a character called Alina begins her intense emotional connection to the dweller inside her device, she needed to know if the person was a man or a woman, how old they were, where they lived, what they did for a living, what they liked to do for fun. She needed to judge, urgently needed to decide for herself what kind of dweller she had gotten. In passages such as these, online social networking quickly and disturbingly evolves into, as I stated, participatory surveillance, producing, to use Lockwood's terms, a communal stream of consciousness. Finally, in both novels, through the fusion of social media and the home, in Lockwood's case, always being on her iPhone in the domestic setting, and in Schweblin's, the canvassing of private internal domestic spaces with smart devices, through this fusion, we come to see how bodies are implicated in data valence online, even though the theoretical paradigms suggest the opposite. And even when people do not realize that monitoring is taking place. In this new dominant paradigm, as Cheney-Lippold observes, in data selves, our datified subject relations do not free us from our bodies or control us completely. Rather, they produce a subjective index for encounter. Moreover, the specific narratorial approaches taken by each of the two novelists I'm touching on reveal, I think, the ways that globally circulating devices in the contemporary moment are absolutely not, despite their marketing rhetorics, taken up equally around the world. And many can in fact be used to marginalize, oppress, constrain, and even end human lives. And so in closing, the novels I've touched on in this talk use both traditional and experimental literary aesthetics and poetics to show us how contemporary network spaces are increasingly felt and experienced on the margins of consciousness, through fleeting social and ephemeral interactions that look quite different from the often invoked panoptic tower or the unidirectional cyberspace of the 1980s science fiction novel. And it is through the study of these emerging aesthetics and subjective registers in contemporary literary texts that we can perhaps gain a better understanding of how surveillance is not only far more complex, culturally enmeshed, discursive and participatory than previously thought, but is also taking on striking new forms, becoming a form of entertainment or reward, a rhetoric of self-love or disguise, an artistic mosaic of real and computer-generated images, and perhaps even an interface between friends. And even, in the not-too-distant future, perhaps a cute but terrifying fluffy rabbit gliding across our living room floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sumner, for your very lucid and fascinating presentation and very fresh perspective on the disturbed cognition in contemporary social media novel. Now I would like to open for questions, but let me first stop the recording.